already? Let's get started. There's an old Mexican proverb that says that you should not take care of the fly that is on your friend's forehead with a hatchet. And quite frankly, this kind of is a little bit of exactly what Lauren and I's stance in today's debate round is while Sarah and Calvin's idea of trying to solve for, or at least improve the system of criminal justice and sexual assault, the result is that we are trying to take care of it with a hatchet instead of something that is more precise. And the fact is that their mandates, and if you were to vote for the affirmative, would really ultimately not even solve the problem and would actually create negative consequences in doing so. And what I want to do is going over those very reasons. Lauren's going to talk a little bit about the arguments that Calvin brought up in his last speech, but I'm going to talk about some new arguments, given that it's still the constructives of why exactly you should still vote negative. The first one is talking about really asking the question, how exactly did we get here? How exactly is there a system that Calvin and Sarah are presenting here today? This allegedly so hard and harsh and terrible system. Well, the issue here is that the reason why we're here in the first place is because the government, in fact, established certain standards. It's going to be very important when we look at that. When we look at this piece of evidence from Preston Cooper, a contributor for Forbes on May 2nd, 2017, quote, "The Obama administration exploited the power of federal aid programs to implement its agenda on sexual assault and transgender issues. In sexual assault and harassment cases on campus, the administration required institutions to use a low standard of proof and employ untrained administrators as adjudicators or else face the threat of losing federal funding. The result was a string of wrongful expulsions and subsequent lawsuits as colleges scrambled to comply with the rules. The department's power grab was well-intentioned, but it ultimately created more problems than it solved," unquote. Now this might be, you might have a big question mark in your head, in that this is specifically talking about how terrible our system is in the current system. What you'd like to do is point you to how exactly the Obama administration was able to create this terrible system. And the reason why is because the Obama administration established or tried to create standards that had a low standard of proof. Now this is very, very important because this is exactly what Sarah and Calvin are trying to do in today's debate round. Let's look at Mandate 3 of their plan text. They say, quote, "The Secretary of Department of Education will direct the Office of Civil Rights to take 1 year to develop strict and appropriate uniform procedures for universities to use in order to properly address claims of sexual violence in conjunction with the law." Well, ultimately what this is saying is that they're not even really trying to solve the issue itself. What they're allowing is giving the opportunity for the government to just create a new set of standards to solve for this problem. However, if you voted for the affirmative team, it wouldn't actually solve, because we've seen before in historical precedent as the reason why we're here in the first place, or allegedly here in the first place, is because the federal government was the one responsible of setting these sorts of standards. This is ultimately a reason why you should vote for the negative team, because regardless of whether or not you agree with the affirmative, you cannot vote for them because they would not be able to solve for the problems that they specify in their case. The next issue that I'd like to talk about is dealing with an issue of standing. And this issue of standing is, I'm sure Mr. Smith and Mr. Uwe, you're familiar with this principle, in that in order for an individual to bring a case to law, that individual has to be one that has proven an injury in fact. They have to be the ones involved with that particular crime. And so anyone willy-nilly can't go sue somebody else for someone else's sexual victimization. But rather, the individual, the victim themselves, has to be the ones to go to court. Now, why is this so important? Well, the reason why is because the colleges themselves have absolutely quite frankly, they have no injury in fact in particular cases such as sexual assault. And because of that, they can't even go to court, they can't even really, I guess they can report that to the police, but they cannot in fact take any sort of procedure with the criminal justice system in the first place. So the fact is that they have to prove that they have standing, and they don't actually have that. The next issue that I'd like to talk about is actually a disadvantage. And this is going to be asking the question, why do we have a system here in the first place right now? Now, the reason why we have these tribunals, as Calvin is now calling it, is because of logistical issues. And keep in mind, there's a big question of whether or not a alleged sexual assault or sexual harassment case actually occurred. There needs to be some sort of closure where if you're in a co-ed dorm, for example, and there's an individual that is sexually harassed, has conducted sexual harassment, there needs to be some sort of logistical situation where the victim is removed from that particular institution. Now keep in mind that, quite frankly, police can in fact do some sort of situation with that, but a college is way more ample in trying to remove alleged victims, from that particular institution, from that particular place in which they are allegedly harmed. Keep in mind that the reason why we have these tribunals in the first place is not to convict. It's not the reason why we're just proving innocence and proving guiltiness. And keep in mind, even though certain colleges might actually do that, the affirmative team has the burden to prove that that's ample justification to completely wipe out the entire system itself. But yet there are colleges themselves that have used this sort of system. In fact, this was recognized by Tina Lowe on January 24, 2017. Quote, advocacy groups such as Know Your 9 Law the system for focusing on victims rather than the justice process. Schools, unlike criminal courts, are focused on survivors. And support and advocacy for rape victims are obviously important, but justice itself is supposed to be blind. While universities do need an internal system to manage student contact after an assault, say if the students live in the same dorm, and schools should provide support for victims of trauma, university bureaucrats have proven to be incompetent of administering justice. What we see here in this particular instance is really, it's not even really a talk about criminality. The criminality is talked about in the courts, and if a victim wants to bring that to the court and try to prosecute a sex offender, they most certainly can do that. But the question of these tribunals is how exactly are we supposed to deal with this issue, particularly on our campus? Whether that is to simply take that individual from a dorm, or to simply change classes, or to give an extension for homework. All of these sorts of situations are questions that these tribunals have to answer. And if you were to vote for the affirmative team, you would be essentially restricting the federal government, or restricting colleges' ability to actually do this. Now, don't get me wrong, I believe that a lot of sexual harassment cases can be brought to the police. In fact, individuals should be brought to the police. But once again, it's that same question that Lauren has been talking about in her last speech as well. Is this justification to force victims to go and say things that they don't necessarily are able to say right now? The fact is that if they're not ready, then we should not force them into that situation. We should simply allow the system to occur, and if they're willing to go and seek prosecution, they can do so through the court system that's already put in place. It's for this reason that I ask that you negate the affirmative team's policy and vote for the negative. Thank you.
Hello, Josiah. I'd like to say congratulations on making it to Octa Finals.
You as well, Calvin.
Yes. I just, of course, have a few questions about your speech. So first of all, let's talk about the standing issue for a second.
Yeah.
So did you provide any legal experts saying that this would cause the colleges not to be able to report these crimes?
Well, in order to prove standing, you have to prove a personal injury in fact. And if an organization tries to do that, they have to prove that they were personally involved with sexual harassment cases.
I'm not saying that they're bringing a suit. I'm saying that they're reporting to law enforcement. Did you provide any evidence that they cannot report these crimes to local law enforcement under your standing?
Sure, but that's not the point. The point is that if you're trying to solve through prosecution, they can't.
Hold on a second. I'm just asking if you provided any legal experts saying this.
We did not provide any. I don't think that's even necessary. Standing is pretty well known legal term. The issue here is that it doesn't matter if the college.
Okay. I know very well what you believe on standing. I'm just asking if you provided any legal experts backing you up on that.
Right. Once again, I did not
specifically
quote it.
Thank you. Okay, we can move on from that. Okay, so you talked about the Dear Colleague letter, essentially the standards that were put in place that were bad standards, correct?
That they were bad standards. Yeah. The reason, allegedly, the reason why the system exists in the first place, according to Preston Cooper, which is actually an advocate for the affirmative, but actually it's not even an advocate for the affirmative. The reason why the system exists in the first place, or allegedly why it happens in the first place, is because we've allowed the government to simply provide some sort of standard. And that's exactly what you're doing in Mandate 3, where you're simply you're doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
You would agree that those standards, those mandatory standards that were faulty, were repealed, were rescinded by the current Department of Education, correct?
Yes, the Dear Colleague letter, which is the policy itself, was in fact repealed by Betsy DeVos.
Okay, and that would be the Department of Education that would be creating these uniform procedures, correct?
I guess, sure, but that doesn't prove that there's the standards that Betsy DeVos is going to implement are necessarily better.
You would agree that we, in our plan, in these procedures, we do mandate that we abolish the police optional approach, yes?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, and we abolish the single adjudicator system, yes?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
The problem is Mandate 3.
Okay, we can move on from there. Okay, so let's talk about the issue of expelling a student. So to expel a student, you would need to prove whether they are guilty or innocent, yes?
I guess you could, yes. But the problem is that it's not just expelling a student, it's also talking about logistical questions of how are we supposed to deal with this issue in the first place. And that's why the tribunals, or whatever you're going to call it, that's why they exist in the first place, is dealing with those issues.
Should issues of attempted murder be handled on college campuses?
Of attempted murder?
Yes.
I mean, murder, I don't think you can. I mean, there's
no further questions.
Okay, murder is definitely different, but we'll see. Yep.
Yeah. Seems as though we're all ready. Awesome. Everybody else, all right. There have been a lot of arguments going back and forth throughout today's round. I provided 2, Calvin provided, I think, 4 or 5. But what I want to do in this speech is really go back to those 2 core arguments that I gave earlier. And as we go through these arguments, we're also going to be looking at some of the things that Calvin said, and ultimately seeing why it still stands that the affirmative teens policy silences victims, and that it's forcing an option, not creating another one. But the first point that I'd like to go back to is that it silences victims. Now, Calvin had a couple of problems with the evidence. The first thing he said, it was from an advocacy group and not actually from professionals. We need to remember that advocacy groups are made up of professional advocates. That's the reason why they created an advocacy group in the first place. It's not like these are inherently biased, they simply have experts within them. But further, the piece of evidence wasn't just quoting the advocacy group. In fact, it specifically said, according to these studies and research done in the research arm of the U.S. Department of Justice. So we're not just talking about this advocacy group. I also provided specific studies from the U.S. Department of Justice themselves, which clearly show that such a proposal would create a chill among victims. Now, Calvin gave this, basically he said that this was from an advocacy group, and he provided his own piece of evidence, which was a study done with a lot of people, apparently a lot of people, and what they decided is they found that 52% of them, I believe, would be more likely to report their sexual assault case with the affirmative teens proposal. Yet there was a clear problem with this, and that's what I found out right before this speech. I asked the affirmative team if they had any specifics on the survey at all, and they didn't actually know how many people were included in the survey. The entire affirmative team's argument that more people will report is based upon this survey, yet they have no idea how many people were in this survey. For all we know, it could be 5, 10, 100, 5,000. We have no idea how many people were in this survey, so there's no reason to trust Sarah and Calvin here over the pieces of evidence that the negative team has indeed provided. The next thing that I'd like to talk about is how ultimately the criminal justice system cannot guarantee confidentiality. Now, Calvin read this piece of evidence, and what he said is this directly responded to the issue because it said that victims will still be able to remain confidential. Yet he never responded to the evidence that I read, which said, quote, the criminal justice system cannot guarantee that type of confidentiality, unquote. Calvin and Sarah have never responded to the logic the evidence gave in the first place, which is that ultimately the criminal justice system cannot guarantee the type of confidentiality. That victim who wants to remain confidential will not come forward in the first place because the criminal justice system cannot guarantee confidentiality. And Calvin and Sarah have never provided evidence that states the direct opposite. It's still clear at the end of the day, ultimately what the affirmative team's policy does is it silences victims, and indeed it forces another option. This again leads me to that second point, that the criminal justice system is always an option. One of the things that Calvin mentioned in his speech is that the system we have with these tribunal courts or these tribunal boards on campus specifically undermine due process and so on. But what we need to recognize is the purpose of these tribunals isn't due process. The purpose of these tribunals isn't to determine innocent or guilty. The main purpose of these boards on campus, as Josiah mentioned, are for students who don't want to go to the police, but might want to have an extension on their homework because of these traumatic circumstances. They might want to change their class schedules so they're not with that same person who they felt sexually abused by. They can also change specifically what dorm they're in. If they're in the same dorm building as someone who they have accused of sexual assault. It's not like these tribunal courts are intended to determine due process. In fact, the underlined portion of Calvin's evidence reiterates just this thing. It says again from Hans von Spokesifigi, I believe that's how you say it. It says, quote, "The rights of both the accused and the accusers must be protected and balanced to achieve justice, including at private universities, even if constitutional due process rights do not apply in that setting," unquote. What we need to remember is these due process rights don't apply in the setting of these tribunal courts because that's not the purpose that they exist in the first place. If Sarah and Calvin want to claim that this purpose has been shifted, then the affirmative team policy could be renewing this original purpose of these courts, or rather of these boards. So that purpose of changing around class schedules, moving your dorms. But that's not a reason to then mandate that they have to go and report it to a police. This is something that we really need to understand. The affirmative team's policy isn't creating a brand new option. With the status quo, victims, or alleged victims as Calvin would like to call them, can go to the police system if they would like to. What the affirmative team's policy does is silence victims from even trying to change their class schedules, or get a change in a dorm, or even get extension on homework because of his traumatic circumstances. Where will these victims that might not have enough evidence to go and determine a guilty or innocent verdict, but still would like to have basic things such as moving around class schedules? At the end of the day, because the affirmative team is forcing an option, not creating one, and ultimately silencing victims, I urge you to vote for it. Would you like to turn to the court time? Thank you.
Mrs. Saunders, Mr. Lee, Mr. Smith, if you're ready. Allison, Lauren, Josiah.
Yes.
All right. Mrs. Saunders, Mr. Lee, and Mrs. Smith, I would like you to imagine for me for just one moment that unfortunately one of your children had experienced a case of sexual violence. The fact of the matter is, if under the current system your child went to their university and asked the university to help them, the way the university handled that would differ from state to state and school to school. The fact of the matter is that college would handle it the best way it benefited them. The unfortunate thing is by allowing universities to handle Title IX sexual violence claims, the universities are doing what's best for them. Whether it's best for them to say, yes, you were sexually assaulted, or whether it's best for them to say, nothing ever happened, we're never going to speak of it again. The fact of the matter is we're allowing universities to cover their eyes, ears, and mouths to the problem of sexual violence on university campuses, and we can't allow that to happen today. Today we're going to be looking at 2 points. Starting with point 1, the current reality. Point 1, the current reality. Several times Lauren and Josiah have said the current reality is better than the affirmative team's plan. So let's look at what the current reality looks like. Danielle Elizabeth DeVold said, ultimately, the importance of Title IX should not be dismissed. However, it cannot be treated as a mandate that the sexual assaults of college students be converted into the problem of educational institutions. Doing so has led college administrators to downplay the seriousness of sexual violence on campus. The frivolous treatment of sexual violence not only fails to deter perpetrators from becoming repeat offenders, but it also fosters the ability of perpetrators to continue assaulting. The fact of the matter is, right now the current system is allowing future potential victims to be harmed. Carrie Smith says 7 out of 10 college students said they have no faith in their university's process for handling claims of sexual violence or confidence in those who administer it. The fact of the matter is 70% of students have no faith in their university's process. The reason for that is because universities do what's best for them, not the best for their students. Carrie Smith says, a problem with not having mandatory reporting for universities is that sometimes the university's interests will conflict with that of the victim and will then lead universities to insufficiently investigate sexual violence. Danielle DeGould said, as a practical matter, when a victim files a sexual assault complaint with the university, the investigation of her assault will be in the hands of a powerful institution that has its own priorities. What we have to understand is right now the current reality is that universities are doing what's best for them, and this comes at the cost of hurting the alleged victim and hurting the accused. Over and over, the negative teams say we need to do what's best for the victims. However, they're not doing what's best for the victims. If we really want to help alleged victims today, what we're going to do is we're going to help them go back to the criminal justice system. Now, that brings up an interesting point. In her last speech, Lauren said that the criminal justice system is always an option. However, she never responded to the piece of evidence Calvin read in his last speech, specifically stating colleges encourage victims to not go to the police. Why? Because colleges have their own vendettas. Once again, what we need to understand is the negative team is never truly understanding what the affirmative team is standing for. The affirmative team is not saying that victims currently can't go to the police. What we're saying is that colleges shouldn't say, don't go to the police, we'll handle it in-house. Instead, colleges should be reporting that to the police. Right starting from there, I'm going to respond to what Josiah said about standing. Josiah was right in what he said about setting. Josiah was right in what he said about standing. However, something that's interesting to mention is that in his speech, specifically involving this, he said, quote, I suppose they could be reported to the police, unquote. That is our plan. That is the point of our plan. That's the point of our mandate 1. So the issue of standing falls flat because Josiah specifically says our mandate 1 could and should happen. Well, not should. He didn't say that. That'd be great for me. All right. The fact is, Carrie Smith said the fact that there are no consistent procedures in place by most universities, coupled with a lack of relief offered by courts in their interpretation of Title IX, makes students less likely to report sexual assault when it does occur. The fact of the matter is, students don't report sexual assault because they're afraid of the criminal justice system. They don't report sexual assault to their institutions right now because they don't have faith in the current university process. However, this leads us to point 2. Point 2, the solution. Point 2, the solution. Now, in her last speech, Lauren said, they gave statistics, but they don't have numbers, therefore don't listen to them. However, the fact of the matter is, these are the only statistics presented in the round. Not only that, but according to student life, Claire, a victim of sexual assault, said, I strongly believe it must be written in the Title IX policy that the school must work with the police and support students reporting to the police. The fact of the matter is, we brought up examples of personal victims saying they want a plan and statistics saying they want a plan. The affirmative team has done neither. They have not given you personal survivors and they have not given you statistics. They've just said, these people say that's what survivors want. Don't listen to what people say the survivors want. Listen to the very people who were the survivors. Listen to the facts and stand with RAIN, the American Trial Lawyers Association, and stand with the criminal justice system today. And I ask you to stand with the affirmative team. Thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure speaking for you all today.
Would you lead your department?
Yeah, just a little bit. negative team have talked a lot about a plethora of different things. We've talked about a chilling effect of whether or not victims would be able to really report certain things to the police in the first place. We've talked about different issues of what really is even the point of this tribunal, and quite frankly, we've even talked about allergies. And the fact is that everything in today's debate round centers around a philosophy that the affirmative team is trying to paint a picture for you of what is the worst possible case of a tribunal making the wrong decision. However, what I'd like to point to you is that the affirmative team has a burden of proof. The burden to show to you that it would be a better system to vote for the affirmative team and eliminate all of these different procedures and eliminate the optional standard of presenting to the police. And quite frankly, they are also trying to, in essence, try to take all the arguments from the negative team and present them, try to basically get around it by simply allowing the federal government to replace those standards with supposedly better ones. The problem is that every single one of these is a reason why you should vote for the negative. What we're going to be doing is two voting issues, two reasons why you should vote for the negative at the end of today's debate round. The first voting issue can be written down as the purpose is logistical. The purpose is logistical. Let me ask you the question. Yes, there are certain instances where there is an alleged situation where there is sexual harassment. The question then becomes, how exactly is a college supposed to really solve, or not exactly solve, but answer that particular issue? It doesn't matter if it's alleged or if it actually occurred. If a victim notices that, or at least claims that she has been sexually harassed, then there certainly should be some sort of measures to try to answer for that. The affirmative team has basically said, well, it really doesn't matter because we're doing what's right here. The problem is that that's not really even the point. The point of the system is not to convict criminals. The point of the system is simply answering a bunch of questions. If a victim is in the same class as an alleged sexual offender, then there needs to be some sort of question or answer to how to solve for that issue. And the only way to do that is by keeping these tribunals and the standards that we already have. Now keep in mind that Lauren and I are not at all contesting that the system is perfect. No system is perfect. But the problem is that as a result of voting for the affirmative, you simply just allow the government to create these standards and eliminate the optional standard, or force victims to basically bring forth their sexual harassment problems. Then ultimately this is a system in which justice isn't administered. It's one in which we're literally forcing people to do things that they are not comfortable in going and doing. Keep in mind that people can most certainly go up to an individual, or go up to court and talk to the police about a particular issue, but if they are uncomfortable in doing that, there are also alternative options in making sure that they are removed from that particular area. That's what the status quo is advocating for, and is why I would ask that you vote for the negative. The second voting issue that I'd like to talk about is dealing with a chilling effect. Imagine what would happen if victims did not want to bring it to the police, but were okay with bringing it to this tribunal and at least trying to solve for this issue. Well, if that means that it has to be reported to the police, and that means that they're not going to be going up to the tribunal at all. Now, it is true that we've talked about studies and statistics and whatnot, but the problem is, as Lauren pointed out, there was no specifics in the methodology. How exactly was that survey even conducted? And not only has the negative team presented a survey, but rather research that specifically says that it backs the claim that less than 5% of rapes or attempted rapes are ever reported to the police, according to a 2000 study by agencies in the research arm in the U.S. Department of Justice. This entire system is creating a chilling effect in which individuals are no longer able to even speak about what they want if they are uncomfortable in bringing this to the police. Once again, if they want to bring it to the police, they most certainly can, but there are alternatives in doing so and trying to be removed from that particular situation. Keep in mind, and we'll even read another piece of evidence from Advocates for Youth, knowing your title branch. This isn't a replacement for reporting to the police. It's a parallel option for survivors based in civil rights rather than criminal law. The purpose isn't to convict criminals. The purpose is simply to answer a couple of questions. And that is why I would ask that you vote for the negative team. Thank you.
So, if everyone's ready. As Dr. K.C. Johnson and Stuart Taylor said in 2017, sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants, Justice Louis Brandeis wrote more than 1 century ago. But colleges go to great lengths, even beyond the dictates of federal privacy law, to keep sexual assault proceedings in the dark. We must bring light to these proceedings, and we must allow the criminal justice system to be involved in this process. In this speech, I'll provide you with 2 voting issues, showing you why precisely you should vote for the affirmative at the end of this round. Now, I believe that to vote affirmative, you should look at these worlds. You should look at the world of the negative, and you should look at the world of the affirmative. And you should weigh them, and you should decide which world is better at the end of the day. Is it better to have these Title IX tribunals in the dark, in these proceedings where no protections are given for the accused, and they don't even handle these accusations? Sometimes they handle them improperly, even for the alleged victims. Is it better to have that system, or is it better to have a system with the criminal justice, where the criminal justice system is involved, and where they have the expertise and the ability to actually provide justice and not harm future victims of sexual assault? Let's lead to voting issue 1, a broken system. Again, a broken system. These Title IX tribunals have essentially intruded on the sphere of the criminal justice system. I would like to point out that the negative team has never really responded to any of our pieces of evidence, and we have brought up 21 throughout this entire debate round from legal experts, showing you why precisely the system is broken and why the criminal justice system will solve it better. All they have quoted from is activist organizations saying that Title IX is a good system. We have quoted from many, many legal experts detailing the problems with these tribunals and why the criminal justice system is better. They have responded to 0 of those pieces of evidence. They have not responded to the evidence from Joseph Cohn, Robert Shibley, Stuart Taylor, Hans von Spakovsky, Stephen Henrich, all of these legal experts showing why the current system is broken and why we must change it. This leads to 2 main impacts that have never been responded to, and they've never really weighed the impacts in this round, so I would like to do that for you today. Now, the first thing that happens, the first impact, so you could call it, is that it harms due process. They never responded to this piece of evidence from Stuart Taylor Jr., who said that administrators have empowered campus bureaucrats to decide students' fates and train them to view accused males as almost always guilty. Hundreds, if not thousands, have been falsely branded as rapists and expelled or suspended with life-changing consequences. This has never been responded to, and the fact is that these institutions are working as a proxy for the criminal justice system. They're just not doing their job very well. They're expelling people who are innocent, and they are not taking they're not doing proper proceedings when it benefits them, when someone who is alleged, when someone who is accused is actually a very important figure to a college, such as an athlete, that college does not want to take proper accusations towards them, so it provides justice to neither party. But the second thing that it does is it harms future victims, and this has never been responded to at any point in this round. As Hans von Spakovsky said, the OCR has put other potential victims in jeopardy by literally giving some rapists and other dangerous predators a get-out-of-jail-free card. I believe this is essentially the most important issue in this round. Even if you believe them that it might have some of the effects that they say, this does not outweigh the fact that we are giving some rapists a get-out-of-jail-free card, and we are stripping protections of due process from all those involved in these situations. This leads to voting issue 2 of the solution. Again, the solution. The negative team has made broad, sweeping generalizations, but they have provided no statistical evidence. They have quoted activist organizations, but no true experts. I think we can see the clear delineation here between the evidence the negative has provided and the evidence the affirmative has provided. Let's look to the study. The study said specifically that 56% would be more likely to report. 29% would have no effect on their reporting, and 15% would be less likely to report. This shows data for increased reporting under mandatory reporting laws. Furthermore, as Carrie Smith said, hearing sexual misconduct the first part. The fact that there is no consistent procedures in place by most universities, coupled with the lack of relief offered by courts in their interpretation of Title IX, makes students less likely to report sexual assault when it does occur. In fact, statistics show that less than 5% of rapes on college campuses are reported, unquote. They have no confidence in the system. You will not decrease reporting if you vote for the affirmative. All that you will do is increase the due process protections and increase the ability of these universities to handle these issues in a proper way without the police optional approach and without a single adjudicator system. I would urge you to vote for justice, for due process, and for both victims and those who are accused of sexual assault. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking for you today.
Mr. Smith, thank you so much.
Thank you for judging, Mr. Smith.
Mrs. Saunders, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Wee.